Podcasting since 2005. This is the King of Podcasts Radio Network. KingofPodcasts.com.
Radio's future is all in the hands of the nation's capital.
The King of Podcasts Radio Network proudly presents the Broadcasters Podcast. Here is the King of Podcasts.
Welcome to episode 375 of the Broadcasters Podcast. This is King of Podcasts here with you. Welcome you to another episode of the program. A little dust up of the opener, a little opening, a little update to it. Get all the voiceovers all mashed up together, right? Anyway, thanks for joining me here on the program with me, KingofPodcasts.com. Of course, you can find the show all major podcast platforms: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, and so much more. So we have radio to talk about tonight. There's quite a few things that are being brought up in terms of what radio has to go through and where Washington, D.C. is the focus of all of it. There's a lot here. Let's get into a couple of things that have actually happened when it comes to radio, as the ownership rules were kind of focused and showcased this week in not the Supreme Court, but a federal court. We had that going on. It was an appeals court that got going to hear about this, but it's very important to go ahead and note about it. Then we also have the infinite dial study from Edison Research. They have now compiled a lot of information. We want to go ahead and bring up on that, among other things. And on top of that, the Broadcasters Caucus convenes in Congress to support local media. So all that's coming into the fray, we're going to get into all of it. A couple other things also going on when it comes to issues with the layoffs going on in Hollywood, because it's already starting to become a thing now with the second quarter. Earnings going to be coming up pretty soon for folks, or first quarter reports. So media companies are going to start laying people off. It's what they do. Music revenue going up thanks to streaming, but it's not the whole story. There's a lot to go into it, so let's go and get into things right now. But in the meantime, radio continues to have their issues right now that are at the behest of Washington, D.C., whether it's the SEC, whether it's Congress. We're looking at what's going on with that. Let's go into the main part of an appeals court hearing a broadcaster's challenge to SEC media ownership limits. So very important to see what would happen if this moves up to the Supreme Court and where things are with SEC ownership limits. That we have the courts actually looking into this right now as we speak. I'm curious because the SEC had to go ahead and be featured on this, and I want to see if we get something where legal action comes into play, where the FCC has to do something about where, if they're going to look at deregulation, like we talked about last week, or it wasn't 2 weeks before, if that's something they're going to go and look at, and if we need to go and focus on the fact that the FCC might get told, hey, there's something we can't be doing with it comes down to this. But here's what we have right now. So a 3-judge panel on Wednesday heard a challenge brought on by broadcasters and the latest decision-making by the FCC. The 8th Circuit Court of Appeals were listening to an argument that radio and TV stations face greater competition from digital giants. The judges offered no clear direction on whether they would order the FCC to revise limits on station ownership as part of its quadrennial review. Nothing's being said, but the fact is we're actually hearing something about this now. This is what I want to go and find out, and this is what is kind of the quiet part out loud. This is an important decision to go and see what's going on right now. So Andrew Kilberg argued on behalf of the National Association of Broadcasters and several companies challenging the FCC's December 2023 decision that retained the local radio and local TV ownership rules, making modest adjustments to rules governing the top 4 stations in each TV market. The decision they're looking at right now is whether the judges believe the FCC was correct in concluding that AM/FM remains a distinct market, and due to the unique characteristics of broadcast radio, it is inappropriate to lump it together with streaming or satellite radio. I agree. Because by distinguishing satellite and streaming as competition towards radio, then they think the ownership levels are antiquated. Let me say that one more time. What the rules are being considered right now by this Court of Appeals, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, they're listening to about a direction about possibly ordering the FCC to revise limits on station ownership because they will not look and consider streaming and satellite radio competition, direct competition to radio. This is the part I agree with right here a lot, because I do think that radio needs to be able to stand alone. And it also comes down to the fact that if you want to do competition from the position of saying, okay, what is on a digital platform versus what is on a linear platform. And I think competition needs to be controlled by where it's being controlled from. If it is on the internet, that's a different story. But when we're talking about the airwaves and streaming and satellite, they're not the same. They're just different bands. But AM, FM radio should be treated differently. And television should be treated differently because those are airwaves. The airwaves should be totally different. And this is the part where I don't know if we could see a change to this, where maybe the judges will say, well, the quadrennial review of the FCC needs to go ahead and reconsider a tightening of ownership limits due to this. The National Association of Broadcasters, they want to just get a rubber stamp because then they can let these big corporations just buy more. This is not for the public good. This is not for local ownership of radio or television. No, it's not. But I love that this is coming across. But this is also something that came from the FCC rulings prior to the administration, before Brandon Carr came in as chairman. Now, Inside Radio reports that the likely court decision will be if the FCC was correct when it concluded that AM/FM radio remains a distinct market, and due to the unique characteristics of broadcast radio, it is inappropriate to lump it together with streaming or satellite radio. I hope that these judges rule in the favor that it's inappropriate. That's what should be the answer. And then what we should also look at is there should be more to be said about whether the judges should go and push back at the NAB and not allow this continuing gradual opening up of deregulation. Just because the FCC is opening up public comment for deregulation, and the fact that they met behind closed doors in February with the FCC for this very issue right here, and now we have this court case on radio ownership limits. Moving on here, broadcasters today are struggling to survive with, I guess, this onslaught of new competition. But see, Andrew, we can have competition from other areas too, okay? I don't think... Now, I know they're talking about the requirements of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, keeping the status quo for local broadcasters, that the commission ignored the requirements. The commission was only able to get that result by irrationally defining the relevant markets in a way that permanently excludes from its analysis all these new sources of competition. Now, David Oxenford represents 6 small broadcast groups. He said their issues were just as pressing as what the major operators face in large markets. He told the court the FCC all but ignored the empirical detailed studies offered by broadcasters to back that up. So 6 small broadcast groups trying to go and compete against the big boys and trying to go and be able to stay relevant, and also to be able to go and just not allow some big corporation to go and take over a market and just swallow up the rest of the competition there is. That's something I want to see changed. We could really benefit some 30 years after the Telecommunications Act of 1996. We would really benefit a reversal back to some reasonable ownership limits. Let's put it like this. Streaming and satellite do not adhere to these ownership rules, because satellite radio, you can have as many stations as if you want. SiriusXM doesn't have to be the only arbiter of satellite radio. And streaming, there are plenty of stations out there for competition. The other thing you have to consider is that broadcast radio on AM/FM do not compete directly so much with what they're doing, because they are competing with each other with personality-driven programming, with talk programming, with music programming, with more commercials than any of those streaming outlets would have. It's a different market. And these broadcast stations are broadcasting. Now, remember, you want to go ahead and make that caveat because of the fact that they have streaming platforms themselves? Well, if that were the case, then why does streaming platforms of these radio stations, why are they being billed as a separate entity? Okay? Because if you want to make this a fair marketplace, then radio stations should be required to not charge for the stream, their live stream online, as a separate pipeline. That they should have a fair advertising deal where, however the station is being broadcast, that advertisers should be able to get a fair deal on being able to get their advertising on wherever the programming for that station is being pushed out. So if it's going out through an AM signal, an FM translator, or the other way around, and they also have a streaming outlet, they should be able to go and advertising on all those outlets. Availability. They should not be going a la carte and saying, okay, we'll let you pay for advertising on the airways, but not on streaming. That's a separate revenue pipeline. No, absolutely not. I would change that. Force the corporate broadcasters to do that too. Now, moving on here in the story, the appellate judges had tougher questioning for SEC Attorney James Carr, saying that competition has to be judged to the prism of the public interest, and the 2023 decision was guided by the goals of competition, localism, and viewpoint diversity. And whether a goal should also be to reduce regulation. Carr said that is one possibility, but not the end game. So the SEC Attorney says there could be a chance of reconsideration of regulations on ownership. He says, quote, the commission acknowledged throughout its order there is plenty of competition coming from these non-broadcast sources. But one critical thing about competition is that there's not much in the way of local content, particularly local news programming. Yes. Streaming does not serve the local content, does not serve local stations, does not serve a local market. One judge said that was a short-sighted viewpoint. You're going to force the locals out of business. End quote. And then James Carr countered and said, we haven't reached that point yet. Broadcasters have been making the same argument for the last 20 years, and if we had accepted their argument 20 years ago, it was not a service of public interest. The hearing made notice that not all broadcasters support relaxing the rules, with several companies having earlier suggested a more modest change that would better serve the marketplace. But the judges were mainly focused on those that do want them and how the media landscape is evolving. I like this. I like that this conversation is being had. Why not be in court? Let it happen anyway. And when it comes to AM radio, this was being held in St. Paul, Minnesota, by the way. Judge Dwayne Benton, who was part of the three-judge panel, raised the struggles of AM in the context of the FCC's media ownership limits. Quote, does this order recognize the death of AM radio? And Carr recognized that there were small AM stations struggling. But the FCC concluded that further consolidation wasn't the answer to their problems, pointing out that the Congress is currently debating whether to make AM required on vehicles. But that's not the part we need to worry about. When there are so many AM stations going up against FM stations, and keep this in mind, the AM stations, there are enough stations out there on the AM dial that if a local broadcaster wanted to go and buy them, there are buyers. And there are those local operators that would be happy to get an AM signal and do something with it, especially now that the rules are changed with the FCC, where AM stations can acquire FM translators. Plus, they can also broadcast on streaming. So there's an advantage for those that want to go on AM radio. Absolutely. What you do then is you try to work on AM radio to try to get a better signal out of them, or maybe try to improve the quality of the band, which has also been considered before with HD radio. There's things that can be done to improve the technology for radio in general. If you want to do that in the cars. Don't just keep AM radio as AM radio, because we still have issues with the interruption and interference of power lines and various other weather conditions that always alter AM sound. So you need a significantly great sounding AM station to be able to do that. But we know that AM radio can still be profitable, and that some of these bigger corporate radio outlets do not need to be holding on to these AM stations just to homogenize their format with programming that can be heard everywhere else. That's not live, that's not local, nothing. Think about it like that. Here's a funny thing. What if NPR, if they didn't get the opportunity to go ahead and broadcast on the lower end of the FM dial, what if NPR stations were given AM outlets? Like, remember, most of them were just playing talk programming, right? Some are playing classical. Some are playing maybe music formats as a non-for-profit. But if NPR were given AM signals, imagine if they were given that opportunity because ownership limits were changed. And then you made something where relevant programming would be on AM dial, and people would go to the AM dial because there are certain choices available. But people don't want to go to AM dial and look for stations that are going to sound bad, and also just find programming that's going to be just national and not going to have a local flavor. We know the AM radio can have a local thing and also be very profitable. We know sports radio stations locally can do that, and not having an AFM signal. That's also that's something that should be considered as well. This is not the first time a federal court will decide the fate of a quadrennial issue. The Third Circuit was deciding for the last media ownership challenges, and the broadcasters are asking the Eighth Circuit to toss out the quadrennial order altogether. The 2022 quadrennial review, which was 2 years ago, remains unfinished, and the FCC could make changes to it. FCC Chair Brendan Carr will have an opportunity to put a stamp on the media ownership rulebook. So media ownership is not completely a rubber stamp coming up yet. We know there's going to be considerations. We know the NAB was trying to jump in before the deregulation talk was beginning. And now the FCC is here having to go ahead and discuss to these judges in this Court of Appeals, the Eighth Circuit Court, to go through this. I would keep an eye on the next time we have another case where this continues to be heard and see if the courts will persuade the FCC to reconsider regulation of media ownership limits. That would be a wonderful day for radio. I don't care what the corporates think. I want the small local radio operators to have a say and have a spot in here. Because radio was best when we had local operators that had the local interest and the public interest of the market. Because corporate has taken that all the way. And also, what good are they to be irresponsible with their programming, irresponsible with the advertising, because they can't sell the ads, even though they have the ad space they make available on their stations, but yet they can't sell it. And because they can't sell it, they're in debt. They continue to be delisted on their stock price. And they continue to have to go ahead and extend their interest on their debt. I see no reason why we just can't move forward on that. A very important subject. I want something more to be said about this. We're going to keep an eye on this story because I want this to happen more than anything. To continue on about the issues of the courts and lobbyists and all this stuff going on with D.C., let's go to D.C. itself, where the FCC had to go ahead and represent themselves in St. Paul, Minnesota. But let's go back to Washington, D.C. Broadcasters Caucus returns to Congress to support local media. This is from Radio Inc., and it was a bipartisan group of lawmakers that reestablished the Broadcasters Caucus in the 119th Congress, aiming to educate members of Congress on the challenges facing local broadcast outlets and operators. So there are a number of people that are actually somewhere embedded or have been part of the radio process before. U.S. Congressman Mike Flood from Nebraska, Congressman Mark Alford of Missouri, Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania, Darren Soto of Florida. They're all co-chairs of this caucus. Now, Flood founded a media company that grew from a single radio station to a statewide network, was a TV news reporter and anchor in Kansas City, and worked on air for local radio and also covered Notre Dame football and basketball broadcasts for WNDU. And Representative Flood said that broadcast journalism is the cornerstone of how middle America receives its news. The significance of local radio and TV stations cannot be overstated. They help connect communities to the news that shapes our way of life. And Representative Alford says our time in the media gives a front row seat to the stories that impact our constituents' lives, as well as insight into how misguided public policy can harm the local radio and TV stations Missourians rely on. Representative Boyle, who also was part of the Broadcasters Caucus 5 years ago when it was launched, says that both as a student broadcaster and representative for the people of Pennsylvania's 2nd District, I see firsthand how many Americans rely on our local broadcasters for the news they need about our communities in the world. Representative Soto said that our region's diverse communities and dynamic growth demand that we stand together to ensure fair representation. And NAB President and CEO Curtis Legate says these lawmakers recognize the vital role local TV and radio play in every community across the country, yada, yada, yada. So this has been put in place. Now we have this here. But unfortunately, I think these caucus folks, if they're going to be aligned with the NAB, that means they're probably supporting the Local Radio Freedom Act. So they say they're talking about local broadcasting that's important for the local community. Because I'll tell you, I mean, we have such a plethora of news now from social media, but local radio could be able to go and do news once again and actually be an outlet for all this. And again, partner with newspapers and really just kind of bring back a hub of media that comes in that we can really learn from. It can be done, and it has been done. And I would love to go and see that happen again. They don't necessarily have to have people in the newsroom for the radio stations. Just partner with the newspapers. Make it a barter. Let's do something with that. Maybe the local TV stations. I don't know. But I mean, local TV's done it, but they only could do so much because of how much time they're going to be able to get to that anyway. Now, there's a couple of things when it comes to surveys and information that came out we should go ahead and talk about. Jacobs Media, their 21st annual tech survey of 25,000 core commercial radio listeners in the U.S., they put out a finding that on-air personalities continue to outscore music as the main reason for listening. And this has been the same thing since before the pandemic. And a growing share of these listeners are saying they listen less to AM/FM radio in the past year, pointing to personalities of shows no longer on their local radio stations as a reason why. Fred Jacobs mentions about this on his media blog. Says that, quote, just about anybody can afford to have millions of songs available on their mobile device. Great, timely, funny, moving personalities aren't nearly as available or common. Many radio companies, he also goes on to say, that and stations seemingly struggle with this consistently strong audience desire for entertaining personalities. Even as the industry has morphed and has been disrupted by new technology, especially in recent years, a solid personality presence has been a consistent piece that tends to stabilize successful performance for stations, not just for the audience, but also the advertising community. Interesting point to be said there. Let's move along to the Infinite Dial Survey, which is information released by Edison Research, supported by Odyssey, Cumulus Media, and SiriusXM Media. 27 years have been doing this, so key findings they found out now. Podcast consumption is still at an all-time high. 70% of Americans aged 12 plus have listened to a podcast. 51% of those aged 12 plus have watched a podcast. Pretty big change. 73% of Americans aged 12 plus have consumed the podcast either in audio or video format, which estimates to about 210 million people in the U.S. And podcasting now has 55% of Americans aged 12 plus being monthly consumers. Video continues to be more of a metric. YouTube is the service most often right now to listen to podcasts, with a third of U.S. weekly podcast listeners using the service. And a strong male video podcast audience drives higher monthly podcast consumption among men compared to women. 57% among men, 52% among women. And according to the study, they make the point here that say that the overwhelming majority of people who watch podcasts will say that they are podcast listeners, but as more discover via video, it's smart to think that they are just consuming just instead of just listening. It's not intended to all undercut the magic of audio-only content. There's just room for both video and audio in the world of podcasts. Well, it's not so just people are watching the video. It's just that YouTube is just such an easy platform to navigate and search around for content, which is why all my content's up there as well. I mean, anybody that is anybody, if you're putting your podcast content up, you absolutely positively need to go and push it up on YouTube. Like right now, I'm still trying to go and monetize. Like I finally passed the 500 subscriber mark on my YouTube channel, which is a big mark, knowing that it took, 7 years to get there? But I'm finally getting enough momentum to get enough people to subscribe, like almost like 1 or 2 a day. That's not bad. But now I need watch hours. So I need more people. If you're watching on my YouTube channel, or if you haven't done so, please do go ahead and consider listening a little bit longer, because it's really now the CUME. It's the time spent listening, TSL. I need more time spent listening to those podcasts that I put out there. So if you can, a little more retention, maybe just leave it on in the background a little bit and keep listening in, hopefully. And if there's anything I can do to help improve the podcast to make it more listenable so that I give more of the information that you want and you keep it on a little bit longer. Like I don't try to make the shows very long. An hour is at the most. Sometimes they're like 30, 40 minutes. So it depends. It just depends on what we have. Tonight, I'm pretty sure won't get to an hour, but I like to go and at least put everything out there. But also, I'm not putting a time limit on the fact that I just want to get the information out there, get it done, and then cutoff, so that you're not listening to me just barrel along and, puff around here, making more out of what there is. Like, there's time for commentary, but there's time to go and report what's out there that I think is important to bring out on this show, which is what I try to do. They also say public opinion supports social media regulation. Social media reaches 86% of Americans, or 248 million Americans on average, estimated. And 48% of Americans express support for banning social media access for anyone under the age of 16. That's a pretty significant number. But I would say 13. Well, it's 13, I guess, is the number, but they want to go make it a little bit higher. Okay. Online audio is reaching an all-time high, as 79% of Americans listen to online audio monthly, and that's an estimated 228 million people. Among Americans 55 plus, listening preferences for the online radio audio brands they often most use are evenly distributed across multiple brands. And for car audio, among Americans aged 18 plus who have driven or ridden a car in the past month, 88%, 40% have used Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, and 33% actively use one of these systems. I must say, Android Auto, they keep doing updates, and I do like what they're doing with it now, with their changes. I wish they could do more when it comes to the music platform. So like Spotify, hopefully there's a new update on that on Android Audio. I did do something recently where they tried to kind of update the way you can do the queue on there, but it's not perfect, but it's working there. Some other findings they had were smart TVs are now in 3/4 of Americans' homes. Usage on X has increased among Americans 18 plus. 31% of monthly TikTok users. And 39% of them say they would use Instagram more if TikTok were banned. So that's what they got from the Infinite Dial survey. And if you go to Radio Insight, you can actually look at the Infinite Dial survey. And I'm sure Edison Media probably has their own thing as well. EdisonResearch.com. You can find the whole presentation of the Infinite Dial presentation, which is pretty good. A lot of good information about that. But that's the major findings out of that. New Voodoo, which is a research company, they say now that podcast has been synonymous with audio first content, but podcast has now become a video first medium, and that YouTube is dominating podcast consumption while outpacing traditional audio platforms, and that the shift is so significant that the word podcast may be limited to creators, especially those who don't fully embrace video. But we never found a better word for it. So podcast consumption is alive and well across all generations. Regular heavy daily use shows show strong engagement across age groups. For at least 30 minutes of podcast consumption a day, millennials lead the way at 43%, Gen Z 37%, 29% for Gen X, Boomers 12%, and YouTube is still the number one podcast platform according to their research as well. For Spotify, which is the leading audio-only platform, Gen Z females and males engage at high levels, but numbers drop significantly among older demographics. So people want to listen on audio, they go to Spotify. Very interesting. So there was news from the music industry for 2024. It was a banner year in the history of U.S. recorded music. New Recording Industry Association of America stats were put out that the annual wholesale revenues in the U.S., they grew by 2.7% year over year from last year. Lower than the annual inflation rate in the U.S., which stood around 3%. So the U.S. industry didn't actually grow at all. So people were trying to ask, why is it that music is not making as much money? Well, they're saying it's not Spotify. We talked about how Spotify said that their annual recorded music royalty payouts in the United States experienced double-digit percentage growth. On-demand music streaming services were up 3.7% year over year. And Spotify has now confirmed that its annual recorded music royalty payouts increased by 10% year on year. And Spotify had their fourth quarter fiscal results. They said that the firm ended 2024 with 263 million users of paid subscription accounts globally. I'm one of them, of the premium account. And they told investors about 26% of their global subscribers were based in North America, which is US and Canada. And Spotify counted somewhere in the ballpark of 68 million subscribers in North America as of December 31st. And in the United States, the RIAA reports that there are 100 million subscribers for Spotify in the U.S. as of the end of 2024. Huge numbers. From a global standpoint, subscription streaming has boosted the global recorded music for a 10th straight year. 4.8% to $29.6 billion. That's how much the music industry is right now worth. Almost $30 billion all over the world. Subscriber numbers, according to the International Federation of the Phonographic Industry, said in their global music report, subscriber numbers went up 10.6% to 752 million subscribers worldwide of streaming services for music streaming. That is huge. Revenues topping $20 billion for the first time. Pay subscriptions posting 9.5% growth. Advertising supported formats up by 1.2%. Revenue for physical formats fell 3.1% to $4.8 billion after a strong 2023. CD and music video revenues fell. Vinyl marked its 18th year of consecutive growth, up 4.6%. And then when they're looking by the regions, revenues rose in all regions, the fastest in the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa after that, and Latin America at 22.5%. Europe, which accounts for more than a quarter of global recorded music revenues, got 8.3%. Australasia revenues for 6.4%. U.S. and Canada, which represent 40% of all global revenues, up 2.1%. And Asia up 1.3%. So right now, Hollywood is starting to go through more layoffs. The first fiscal quarter is completing. And now media layoffs across the entertainment industry are starting to go ahead and start once again. So here we go. Mattel laying off 120 workers as part of a cost-cutting push. Disney layoffs impacting almost 200 employees across their news division, among other places. So here we go. 6% of the ABC News Group and the company's entertainment networks are laid off. ABC News will undergo a restructuring as a result of layoffs as well. Lionsgate Television, 6% of their workforce is going away, about 80 employees, following unscripted cuts equating to about 5% of the staff in November 2024. CNN has cut 200 jobs since January 25. Meta is warning of layoffs of 5% of employees across platforms in January. And the Washington Post facing around layoffs that impacted 4% of its total staff. That's so far in 2025. So there's a whole thing you can go look at right now on deadline.com. You can find out more about it. Final story to bring up tonight as we wrap things up is about Howard Stern. So there was a time where we used to think, well, anybody that's trying to go ahead and talk about Howard Stern that might have worked on the show, that there's always these people that are going to be like, well, they're all going to be, dunces. They're all going to be like losers because of the fact they're just trying to go and make money off of Howard. But these days, with the way that Howard Stern has gone in terms of apologizing about 6 years ago when he put out that book to try to apologize and try to make good with Hollywood or whatever it was, he's been changing so much. The Howard that we all know is no longer. He's gone. Halfway through his run right now at SiriusXM, he's changed. And COVID really changed him a lot too. So the show that was is not the same anymore. Not even close. And it's funny, I've been watching some documentaries right now. I have watched a number of times Evocateur, the Morton Downey Jr. story, and the whole thing about that show, which was, growing up in the late 80s and finding that show available to watch. That was a wild show because I remember on cable, we actually had WWOR Channel 9 out of New Jersey, and it was available to Superstation. And for whatever reason, we were able to get that show, and then it became syndicated. And Channel 39 in Miami was able to pick it up, and they had it on 11:30 at night, up against the late night shows. And wow, was that something, man. So I caught a lot of those episodes. And by the way, the former producer on that show, Bill Boggs, if you go looking for him, I forget the name of his YouTube channel, but if you want to go look for previous Morton Downey Jr. episodes, he obviously has the access to the old clips, the old shows, and he's putting them up. And it's wonderful. He's putting up new episodes now, And I'm like, I'm so happy to go and see that. But yeah, I wanted to go and see what was going on. Bill Boggs TV. If you go look right now, you can find past episodes of the Morton Downey Jr. show. And I don't know how far back he goes, but he put it up there, and I want to go ahead and find out more about it. So like, I'm totally into that. Totally the fact that he's got that show up there and he's putting it up. It's a wonderful thing. But he's also got a lot of other stuff he's working on himself. But yeah, I see that here, and it's like, okay, that's fascinating. And I want to go and get more time to go look at what he did over there. But if you want to go find some of his previous shows, he's got them up there. So good stuff. Now, let's talk about Steve Grillo, who worked for years at the Howard Stern Show. So now he has a new book, a self-published memoir written with Jason Huza, and the book's called Guerrillo Parts. He worked 6 of his 8 years on the show, and then at the former WXRK New York, when it was at WXRK in New York, he was an unpaid intern before finally making the minimum wage. The 58-year-old Steve Grillo now says he probably asked Howard Stern for a raise, but earned an on-air dressing down afterward, and quit soon after he was offered a raise of 30 cents an hour. He said, quote, to the New York Post, the place was a snake pit. You never know when you were going to be set up. I was always a nervous wreck, and it got worse when they brought me on the show. I'd have ramen quivers cackling in my ears. Somebody would be throwing balls of paper in my face. Then I'd have Howard staring at me with his piercing blue eyes starting all over the place, trying to make me look worse than I already did. One example of this humiliation, Steve Grillo recalls, was Stern pitted Grillo, who was dyslexic, in a spelling bee with Stern's then 11-year-old daughter. Grillo lost, and Stern called him stupid. And then Stern gave him the nickname Gorilla and someone who hated confrontation. But once behind the microphone, Stern continually broke my balls, and I was always getting yelled at, he says, for not preparing his baked potato properly, failing to get him his hot water when he needed it. He made me wear a turban and an Indian outfit that looked like a diaper when I went to get his hot water from a nearby coffee shop. It was embarrassing. Now, his responsibilities as an intern include meeting Stern's limousine each morning at 5 a.m., walking him into the building. There was one time in 1995, the daily routine was accompanied by some genuine fear. He observed a car parked in front of the Madison Avenue location where a guy was standing on the corner. And he instructed Stern's driver to bring the host to the rear of the building as the man who was standing on the street shouted, Howard Stern, you mother effer, I'm going to kill you. I pushed Howard into the building before the guy could do anything. Security came out. Police were called. Guys were put in the handcuffs. I saw a shotgun with 12 shells on top of the car. Nobody was hurt in the incident. So it doesn't sound like he's obviously going to just give his story about being at the show. And it's obvious that we know that Stern's more of a narcissist, control freak, manipulator, right? Who now, these days, is apologizing for what he was, for whatever reason. I don't think it makes much of a difference to me, but that's what he wants to go and do. Whatever. Fine. He can do whatever he wants with himself. That's his story. But it doesn't make me change the way that he has changed the show and what he's become now. It's just a shell of his former self. And this is not something being political. It's just that he's not the same. And, talk about a dying breed. Might have been a dying breed when he left terrestrial radio before, when he had to go and go because iHeartRadio and other, affiliates were just dropping his show left and right. But it doesn't make no excuse for his behavior now and just apologizing for everything. As I said, you don't apologize. Tom Likas told us all that. Why would you do that in the first place? But he did. Whatever. Anyway, that's the program. Episode 375. Thank you for listening in to the Broadcasters Podcast. Make sure to come back next week. And remember that content is king. And the control of your content is in your hands.